have only one stake on story as pedagogy, and that is to change and alter one's mental, one's consciousness, right? If we can aspire as teachers, as educators, as artists, for an altered state of being, then that's all we need to be able to do. And in my journey, I'm really very fortunate that I have students at Shrishti. To me, they are my teachers. And there was this young girl, Mrinmay, whose story I'm going to share today. And then she came back and she said, you know, young people like us are constantly stuck in this world of making choices. Shreya and Priya are very real to us. So I'd like to locate my work in trying to use the story to help people make decisions. So I'm proud here to present Mrinmay's diploma. The story that Mrinmay based her work on is Jalebia. And we did it with people over a few days to understand their dilemmas and to understand how they actually faced choices in their lives. The story on which it was based, the pedagogy, is that in Jalebia there's this little moral dilemma that a young boy is thinking where he's given money by his mother to go pay his school fees, and on the way he's tempted to spend it to buy the sweets, the jalebis, and this question of choice. And as you can see, the girls there wanted to tell the story about when you're riding a bicycle and a boy grabs your chain, do you actually stay and fight for the chain, or do you run away? And the tiger, which is mythically the boy, actually flies because everybody comes and they fight. And it's a story where the students did it on stop motion animation.
Hello, everyone. Today I bring to you a dialogue with educationist Geeta Narayanan. Geeta is the founder-director of Shrishti Manipal Institute of Art, Design and Technology. She also founded the Mallya Aditi International School. We'll talk about imagination, collective consciousness, and future of education. So over to Geeta Narayanan. So, hello, Geeta. It's nice to see you after a while. I remember I was at Shrishti as a commencement speaker many, many years ago. I'm talking to you because I believe as a teacher, as an institution builder, as a person who has deep interest in pedagogy, your thoughts, your life experiences, your stories are of importance for the third generation from now. And I want to preserve it for them.
Thank you. I think that it feels good for me to hear that anyway. Thank you.
So I think one central theme of my whole project is imagination. So my first question is, what is the importance of imagination at an individual level, at a family or community level, and for the society? And that's my question.
Well, I think that imagination is something that is undervalued to start with. As a young person, I was always told I was dreamy, and that was considered a bad thing. And my father would say, please stop daydreaming and get practical and get on to do something. And I say that because that was the voice of his generation. I mean, he was somebody who came just after the freedom struggle, wanted to build India, and was a very man of vision, but a man of hard work and practicality. And he considered this thing of dreaming, which is a facet of imagination, a waste of time. And I think culturally in India, that has been the kind of thing that some of us from some of our backgrounds have grown up with. I won't say it's all. But I think when you say what is of value as an individual, I have always felt that there are many I's in our lives when we get into the teaching and education and pedagogies. And there is an overemphasis on the intelligence, right? Everybody is always talking about today, in today's language, is it spiritual intelligence or is it ecological intelligence? I'm not going back to Gardner and his multiple intelligences, but it's become a kind of meme of our times to talk about intelligence. Nobody ever talks about imagination in the same way, while they talk about products of imagination, such as innovation. Right? So when you are thinking about imagination, I have always been drawn to this from the writings of Radhakrishnan, who in his idealist view of the universe, when he wrote about it, he takes three characteristics of the Indian mind and the Indian intellect. And he says it's intellect, but it's imagination and it's intuition. And he puts those three together, and it forms a substantial part of his text. And I've been deeply influenced by that. I think that personally, imagination is something that I feel is not automatic. People have it, but it can be nurtured, it can be built upon, and there are and it has a huge value in the developing of one's personality. I see that in my grandchildren. I see that while they may be focused in schools on working on the intellect and on the mind, the idea of consciousness, the idea of being able to visualize, to be able to connect in your imagination and build a story, these are things that are coming naturally to one and maybe less naturally to somebody else. So I think that it's a facet of our minds and our personalities, just as the intellect is. But I think that the third combination is that one also has to build in with imagination this ability to intuit, to kind of feel one's way around something. And as you start feeling your way around something, you can be more imaginative. But if you can't take that first step into the unknown, the dreaming cultures of the Aboriginal groups, for example, in Australia and New Zealand, they have a whole culture of dreaming where they set the scene and there are dreaming stories and people get into the mode. And I think as communities in India, we do have that, but it's largely left in the things of indigenous communities and more the unschooled human mind, which is more encouraging of imagination and of storytelling in its own way and craft. The schooled mind tends to not pay such an importance to it, unless you're, of course, branded as you're a creative in terms of whether you write or you are a theater person or you're performative in some way, or as we are in artists and design. So that's the family thing. But as a society, I think that men of the generation of your father and men of those times were brave enough to dream.
Just correcting men and women.
Yeah, men and women. I'm saying that in the sense. They were brave enough to dream, right? And when you are brave enough to dream, you can let go of reality. And that's what holds people back from imagining something, I can't because this is where I am. But you can free yourself of that and let yourself go above it. And then anything is possible. Because in the world of imagination, and that becomes, as Radhakrishnan also points out, the stepping stone for the body and consciousness and other parts to follow. So I think as a society, we do have a tradition. We have it in our philosophical traditions as well. But in what has become the schooling and more a westernized kind of schooling that most of us have had to go to, it has been not something that has been accepted very readily, frowned upon in some places, and therefore is part of people who want to write or dance or sing and want to move into a world of imagination through any form of performance, find themselves a little bit out of the milieu of science and technology and the rationale that they bring to schooling.
Wonderful. So I have one question here. If I remember right, you started your work life as a school teacher teaching
Yes.
mathematics, correct?
Yes, I did.
So mathematics is as I was taught, was the art of numbers and
Yes.
relationships. What's the connection between mathematics and imagination, or is there a connection?
I think there's a great connection in what is abstract mathematics, right? And also in mathematics, for example, if you take things like Kepler's laws of planetary motion, one is looking for patterns. One is then looking for the archetype. One is looking at, I always tell my students, mathematics is only a mirror of your physical world. It is only a different way of explaining a phenomena or a pattern or a property or an attribute of something. You make it quantifiable. You give the relationships the form of an equation or any other mathematical form. And as somebody who didn't really see, I was very good at number work in school. And that's why I was put into an honors program in mathematics. In retrospect, I was probably would have been better off going to NID and getting a degree in design. But nobody thought of it in those days. You automatically took your top scoring subject and that became the major and you went to college in it. But the 3 years that I had in college, I don't know how much mathematics I learned, but definitely I learned the art of extrapolating from phenomena. And therefore, that needed imagination. And that needed an imagination that needed to go perhaps to a very high level of abstraction before I could see the patterns, you know. And that became the first training I had in actually consciously letting go, making an observation, looking at phenomena, looking at how they can be represented, and then making sense of them in squiggles and things that don't make sense to anybody else. And you have to be imaginative to be able to take a quadratic equation or an exponential series and try and see it in nature or try and see it in something else.
So if you were talking to a child who's just being introduced to the science of mathematics, how would you describe what mathematics is about, what its purpose is?
You know, I think that I have always tried, particularly with young children, to dissuade not the children but the parents that mathematics is not as the Sanskrit is Ganita. It is Ganita for in our Sanskritic tradition is the logic of numbers, you know. And we cannot take the logic of numbers and then say it is equivalent to this whole siddhanta of axioms and patterns. That is what mathematics is about. So even with very young children, the mathematics that I normally use is I start with, you know, things that belong, you know, things that don't belong. Can you see a pattern here? Can you arrange something? So you can even just give them a set of stones and say, well, and then they start ranking them as rough and smooth and small and large. And, you know, suddenly you see ascending and descending order appearing in front of you, and then you can introduce them to various things. And I found that then those students have never had a phobia about mathematics. One of the worst things about being a high school mathematics teacher is to get the students through an exam that is absolutely meaningless to them, with problems that they can never decipher and decode. And funnily enough, one of the tricks that I taught myself and I taught young students who were taking these exams is read the question and draw it on your exam sheet. It doesn't matter if the examiner doesn't understand it, you know, but draw it. And once you have visualized your problem in terms of a diagram, then go and solve it. And I didn't have a failure after that. So imagination and how you visualize things, how you can create a pattern on paper, and from that, how is the way you can diffuse what is the real truth of what is mathematics from the fear that it's all about numbers, and if you aren't good in numbers, you can't do mathematics. Because in higher mathematics, there's very little to do with numbers. It's almost all to do with patterns.
So that takes me to another question is, as I was growing up and I was in school, middle school, high school, my mother was helping me understand what my inclination was, so that I could make the right choice post high school as a career choice, learning path. And at that time, the conversations around me, when thinking about what my innate capacities were, about am I more science and mathematics oriented, or am I more humanities and arts oriented? I'm glad that I stumbled into design, where that kind of a bipolar division of my capabilities was not forced on me.
Yeah.
I didn't understand it that time, but because today I understand that for a good mathematician to be effective, she must have a deep understanding of the arts and
Yes.
humanities,
Yes.
so that they can extrapolate what they learn in their knowledge domain in terms of how humanity and the world works. And people in the world of humanities and music and dance and arts need to have an understanding of structuring their thoughts, structuring their creativity using some of the tools that can come from mathematics, science, and so on, so that they can grasp the complexities of what they're creating.
Absolutely. And I think you're very lucky that you got into design, because it kind of melds both worlds, the technology and for industrial design, for example, the whole idea of making something comes from material and understanding and things that come from sciences. But on the other hand, the sheer usability of it, the fact that one is actually doing something with people and one is working with human nature and human understanding, and maybe even phobias or fears of what something can happen, and then you engage with them as well, makes design the critical transdisciplinary space. And I think that's true. But I wanted to make one observation to you, and in response to what you just said. I think that the arts, in many ways, have used many of the structures that come from mathematics. Classical music, whether it's Western or Hindustani or Carnatic, uses in its thing of between the tal and the actually rag, the fact that you have the two going side by side. It's understanding the mathematical rhythm of the beat and then merging it into the melodic, the rhythm, the verbal words and the poetry and so on. So in Western poetry or in Indian poetry, there is rhythm and there is a structure. And there is a structure in many other forms, as you know. But the reverse has not been very true. The reverse has not been that the sciences and technologies have historically been slow. I won't say they've never done it. They're beginning to be more aware of it, but they have taken their time to enter the world of the arts, of humanities, of the social sciences, and other such things. So I just love the way you say you're an ethnographer of imagination, because it takes something that is two completely different worlds and it merges it together and you have something there. That's something that is very badly needed. I think science and technology still stays very much in a bucket by itself and doesn't work.
To your point, I want to add something. I know you are associated with MIT Media or MIT, I think with Media Lab. We used to live in Cambridge for 1 year. And during that time, my wife, who is an Odissi dancer, took an elective at MIT in dance. And she realized that at that time, there was a new belief emerging within MIT that as they train engineers of tomorrow in rigorous process of engineering design, they need to inculcate art into their learning process, and not art as in just art making, but understanding art as a kinesthetic and emotional experience. And therefore, they have several courses as mandatory courses in humanities. And I think that is an evidence that, yes, historically, this other side of sciences may not have explored the arts as much as the arts may have explored the systematicity of the sciences, but that is changing. Would you agree with that?
I think that things are changing. I agree with you. And they are in today much more in a meshed kind of working relationship. But I'm not very sure how much each one is truly going to the core or the essence of something. I think that we tend to adopt something very quickly today. And I'm more a believer in being slower rather than fast. And when we go for this quick adaptation, a quick modeling, a quick prototyping, and a quick exit, whatever you're doing, whether it's engineering or whatever it is, the notion of something that comes, at least particularly from the arts and from music, is there's a longer gestation period. It takes a much longer time for the creative process to be immersed in a culture, immersed in a context, immersed in knowledge traditions. And this is true of West or East. I'm not putting it in any bucket. And then suddenly the aha happens and you have something new emerging at the end of it. And this, in a contemporary world, I find it very hard to say yes or no to your question, because there is a superficial adoption of either artistic methods by the scientists or scientific methods of rationality and empiricism being forced onto people working to get doctorates in arts and design and things like that. I think that one has to take the time to investigate that a little bit more deeply.
I get it. So there's one more point I wanted to draw from one of your YouTube videos.
Mm-hmm.
At one point in one of your videos, you talked about how there is this obsession amongst teachers and parents, even within your schools,
Mm-hmm.
with producing and talking about 100% pass,
Yes.
success rate.
Mm-hmm.
And you are not comfortable with that kind of a mindset. So, and let me finish my point, and then I will ask you a question. And I completely agree with you, because making success as the only way to create a positive self-image in people is a dangerous path and a framework. Because how do we prepare people to embrace failure as a part of learning and moving forward?
Mm-hmm.
And in that process, I remember someone, I don't remember who's coined it, a phrase I heard somebody saying, failing forward.
Mm-hmm.
So now my question to you is, how do you shift the mindset of the system of teachers and parents from thinking about success to thinking about failing forward?
There are many parts to your question. So I'm going to sort of take the question apart a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And then I will try and get you an answer to that, because it's complex. The need to put everything in terms of numbers is an obsession of our times, right? Everything has to be quantified. It is not just in school education. It becomes so much part of our psyche that we quantify in college education. We quantify things in benchmarks. We quantify things in whatever kind of value basis people are evaluating systems in terms of their quality. So it becomes something that is very difficult to unhinge and take apart. This idea that if an institution is successful, then it must be ranked. So, success is not just for a student. Success is also, I've learned, at the level of institutions, and perhaps it's also at the level of economies and nation states today. So we're always trying to measure things. We're always trying. So this 100% was a talk I gave a long time ago. At that time, perhaps I had a lot of tunnel vision at that time. I was looking at a very narrow kind of image of what my world looked like. But over the last, now it's 50 years I have been in this profession over there. I entered the teaching profession in 1971, right? And now it is 2023. It's over 5 decades. What I'm beginning to realize is the kind of value systems, this meaning of success as a mark of getting 100%, or even if you get 85% or 89%, you're a kind of failure. kind of then goes into the next stage of psyche about when you get to work and you encourage within your team and again your thing a sense of competition and putting things into certain value propositions when they are being measured and evaluated for performance. And the same thing then goes up at the institution level as it's a fractal. So you start with the schooling system, you then work it into the workplace, and then the same value chain, then this system goes into institution understanding. And heads, as you know, roll when their numbers fall, and people are then brought in to revive the numbers. You don't know what value somebody is doing, but if the numbers fall, and then you end up with economies. And so today, 50 odd years later, I'm able to reflect on that and say, if this disaster really has to be changed, then we need to change it at every level, right? So failing, I don't think my answer to that, it isn't about success versus failure, right? Neither is it about simplistic terms about competition versus collaboration, and that is cooperation better than a very competitive kind of world where success is measured. I think the whole notion of impact assessment needs to be looked at very clearly. What is it that the person is capable of? What is it that they can do? Amartya Sen has written, along with Martha and others, a lot about how we can use a capability framework to look at this. And I've been looking at that fairly seriously, even at Shrishti. You know, how do we measure people in terms of their competencies, in terms of their capabilities, in terms of the capacity? Can we bring that same thing to the measurement of institutions and then, of course, to bigger ideas, not only to a nation state, but to the functioning of an economy? Because today, this whole economy built on a success model of rating scales and measurement and stakeholder value and shareholders and what NASDAQ has to say, then is all the same continuum to me, Uday. It is no longer just that Geeta talking about that 100%. It's a domino that goes on and on and on, and has had such a destructive thing on our lives, and on people's lives, because they are just unable to fulfill the way those numbers, the number game. So what we need, I think, is to unravel, like a knitting wool, we need to unravel it, and we need to say, can we now wrap it around in different forms and patterns and get the essence of success in terms of what you are capable of, success in terms of where you are, and sometimes you want very little, sometimes you don't want very much. And failure is, you don't need to talk about success at all, because if you don't talk about success, there's no failure, right? What you are calling as failure is the iterative process of tinkering, of jugaad, of trying many options, about not getting disheartened if your first solution does not work, about persistence, about qualities that are habits of the mind. And if we don't talk only about success and failure, but if we talk about these habits of the mind, and my friend Lewis Hetland at Harvard University has talked such a lot about studio habits of the mind. And again, it's something that I've introduced into Shrishti, is think about things like persistence, think about things like trial and error, think about various habits that you have, and then see whether your habits then show a certain inclination, a disposition, that you can talk about what your intent is. And I think we have to take these discussions all the way up to the economy now, because we are really measuring ourselves, measuring madly into the future, things that are not possible. And that's why I'm totally against any future dynamics or future studies or future anything, because again, they're about measurement. So success is only one form of talking about measurement.
Wonderful. That takes me to another question is, in your various YouTube videos I have watched, one word that has come a few times is consciousness.
Yeah.
And I want to probe a little bit about, as a teacher, who focuses on pedagogy, what does consciousness mean to you in terms of cultivating minds and preparing your students to play their part in making of life?
Well, consciousness, again, it's a topic that can be dealt with at so many deeper levels. And I'm just going to talk about it in the context that you have talked about, which is directly with the classroom and with young people or with older people. Consciousness is something that comes where there is an environment, right? You can't have consciousness without an environment. To me, consciousness cannot be separated from the environment. And it is something that comes out of experience. So I think that when we talk about consciousness, we sometimes undervalue experience, right? We think that it's something abstract and out there, whereas actually it is in us, it's embedded in us, it's who we are, and it's our experience. Why have I spent so much of the latter years of my life thinking about experience, about contemplation, about experience, and about consciousness? Is about, I feel that getting young people to talk about their experiences, getting young people to talk about the context, their histories, their backgrounds, where they're coming from, talking to young people about the wholeness of their lives rather than break it up into many different fragments, gives the person then a sense of being complete. And there is a connection between mind and body. There's no doubt about that. So when we are talking as women to fellow women who have faced, say, harassment or abuse or violence, young children who face violence, things like that, we find that they have so deeply embedded into their psychological framework this notion of their traumas, that consciousness is the first thing we have to deal with. The experience, the environment, the relationship, the very, very complex dynamic between mind, nature, body is there. When we actually start doing it through contemplation, through visualization, through conversation, through theater, and through writing and journaling, we feel that we can actually see the liberation of the mind. We can actually see a transformative change in the condition and the way, the vibrancy with which people suddenly respond and become animated and become able to participate. I worry about this a lot over there because today everybody's talking about mental health, right? Everybody's talking about the stresses and the damages we are doing to society because of the considerable amount of mental health strain we're putting to our young people. But we never have the time to talk to them. We never have the time to sit down and say, hey, what's going on? We never have the time to actually care. So this whole idea is, I don't belong to a philosophical school of thought which has consciousness in the abstract, right? I'm just somebody who has worked very hard at understanding and unpicking the relationship between experience, environment, consciousness, the psyche, and releasing and freeing and liberating the human being, the human consciousness from the traumas that it has faced in this time. And I've worked with groups in poverty, abject poverty. I worked with groups that have had undergone a tremendous amount of violent abuse and ostracization. People who just have been marginalized, who are nowhere, whom nobody ever wants to talk to or nobody has any relationship to. And working with these three groups over a very long time with my research team, I found that The answers really are in developing processes that allow participation, that allow expression, and it can come from art, it can come from theater, it can come, and they all have to be designed. These conversations are not just simple conversations about, hey, how are you? It's like your conversation with me, it's a design. And once you go through the design, you're able to release people from whatever confines of their mind, if I'd like to put it, and then their potential expands, and then they become so much more alive to themselves and to their families and to the communities in which they live in. And I think that therefore consciousness is a very core to who I am today in the work that I think about. I'm really past doing much more than thinking and reflecting right now. But I do like to influence more people to have more time for that, to say that sitting with an opening circle at the beginning, having a closing circle at the end of a day. Opening circle allows people to discuss what has happened earlier in the evening or in the night. Having a close, to have people get up in the middle of the day and say, I need a break, I need to talk about something, and then just give them that voice or that space to say, okay, we're going to stop everything now. We have to let this person talk. And slowly, it becomes a culture, it becomes a habit of people listening. I have three fundamental pedagogies that have come out of this process. One is this thing about looking and listening. You have to be able to look and you have to be able to listen. And looking and seeing are different things, So you have to look and then you see, and then you are able to move there. So it is looking and listening. Listening is different from hearing. So you get to, through listening, you're able to hear, I'm hearing things. So that's one thing that I get. The second tool is explore and think. When somebody is talking about something, let's not respond, let's explore, let's just take it apart, let's help them, let's not get analytical, and the third one is making and being. So can you get into the center of the room? Can you become that person? Can you take on that persona? Can you live that experience? And when that is happening, very often there's tears, there's breakdown, but there's a breakthrough. And then you can talk about consciousness, because then you are actually having people working with you in that. So there are three: looking and listening, exploring and thinking, making and being.
Wonderful. So the next idea I want to move to, which is connected to consciousness, is that in my journey of design, my curiosity has evolved, and today I have arrived at a point where I'm beginning to see that design, as I understand, lives not in the material world, but in the collective consciousness and collective imagination in the society. And it's continuous, it's iterative, and it's always under construction. And it just doesn't get created in the studios of designers or in the factories of manufacturers, but in the lives and minds of communities.
Yeah.
And therefore, that aspect of cultivating collective consciousness or imagination requires new ways of participating in its creation. And I found poetry a way of participating in collective imagination, because the art of creating poetry is not a part of me setting a goal and designing something to meet the goal, but it's more about I being curious and open to let the environment enter my consciousness and let my mind connect the dots and translate that new consciousness into something beautiful that I call poetry.
Yeah.
And when I share poetry in a dialogue with a group of people, what is most powerful is they don't hear it as my poetry, but they hear it as I've been told by many people in my dialogues,
Yeah.
as their own inner voice that interprets their own realities and their struggles
Yeah.
and their curiosities. So, this is like a new tool of designing consciousness I discovered. Have you found new tools that are outside of normal domains of knowledge gathering that have worked for you?
I am not so sure that I can say I have found new tools in a way, but I have been, my whole thing is about how to break what Paulo Freire calls the culture of silence. Paulo Freire, when he talks in the pedagogy of the oppressed, he talks about the culture of silence. And he also, in the same way, Amartya Sen talks about the notion of freedom. So you have the two things.
Mhm.
So I feel that when you look at these two people and the way they are thinking, the way what you are saying is very true. There is a need to give people a voice for what they want to say.
Hmm.
And I found that the development work that was done by my husband and what he introduced me to, the participative work and the frameworks that Freire actually developed in Latin America and then other countries, including India, have taken it forward, using non-linguistic methods of participation, representation and even storytelling, perhaps, but not necessarily storytelling with words. It could be storytelling with pictures. It could be storytelling with building an artifact. The minute I learned to work my pedagogy to having participatory methods in which a community, not an individual, works on a visual, a narrative. The form could be a patachitra, the form could be a wall mural, the form could be a statue or a creation of some kind, and a tapestry, and the fact of sitting and embroidering together. So the two things in that toolkit. One is that it's not solitary, it's communal. So the conversation around creating that also brings a voice which is there. They have the artifact which they stand up and share and present about what happened. And then you have that to do. It really it all, I'm sitting here rubbing my hands because that really, it brings goosebumps to see how people suddenly say something that they never intended to say, just because they're working in a community, making something and talking about these things, and suddenly it happens, and it happens in the act of making. So those are, I don't have a toolkit, but I have a process. And that process says, we're not in this alone. Let's make it a community and we will respect each other and work towards it. The second thing is we provide a whole lot of visual material that they can actually work with. Either it's fabric and embroidery, or it's stones, or it's mud, if it's clay, it can be anything that they are comfortable with, not expensive. And then ask them to make something together. And sometimes it can take, singing happens at the same time. Sometimes while they do it and they finish, they get up and dance around it. And then there's a story and a performance that comes from it. And it goes on till late in the evening. But sometimes it's just making a mandala, on the ground. And they bring seeds and stones and leaves and work on it for a whole hour, an hour and a half, and then sit around it and talk. And when they do that, there's a whole voice that comes, that people who have been silent in other forms of participation suddenly begin to talk. So that's what I've done, but I don't have a toolkit.
I hear you. So I have also heard that moment when I think Tesseract at that time was making a presentation of their design ideas for design of your school. And there was
Yes.
another architecture firm which was also making a presentation.
That was, I said, we fell in love with design.
Yeah, and yes. So, and then that's when you heard about design, you differentiated between architecture and design, primarily because I've heard from Jacob the fact that Jacob came early for the presentation. He found a messy space and they picked up a broom and cleaned up the space.
Yeah.
And you guys were impressed by the fact that taking a broom in the hand and cleaning up the space was a part of Jacob's way of being a part of that visioning that you called him for. And he defined it as a part of design process. And then he took you to NID because you said, what is design? And he took you to NID. But what I also heard is that seeing you were inspired and curious by the idea of design, but when you went to NID, you felt what your inner voice made you curious about the design was something more than what NID was practicing. You kind of felt that it was stuck in time, which means you had a bigger vision of what design is. So this question is, what is that vision of design that you did not see at NID? And I don't want you to present it as a critique of NID, but I want you to present it as, what is that bigger vision that you had an innate understanding of that guided your path to creating a design institution?
I just met great people. I knew Poonam and Jacob, John Matthew, his older brother, who really stood by even today, he's uncompromising about what he considers design. And his thing can be photography, it can be manufacturing, it can be many processes in between. And even these young boys who were the architects for the building, Harsha, Shiv Kumar, and his now wife, Sanchali, they were young people in a design college, but they just were so full of the spirit of the possible, how they could work with it, how John just sat me down and said, Geeta, learn the design process. This is the design process. Now, he was a young man then, and I was not all that much older than him, but it was, to me, it was the way he knew what design process was in the real world. And the only thing I found when I went to NID is the fact that when these processes become mechanized, and stereotypical, and this is what is canned and given to people, I'm not so sure that everybody else now got what that first generation, of which all of you are a part of, got, that kind of spirit. However, I would say that all of us grow in times, and NID was growing with its own times, and it had its own story to tell, shall we put it that way? And they went through their own journey of meandering, and so did we. But I just found that till today, I have to say that the inspiration for me and what I saw as possible came from my conversations with all these people who were such wonderful human beings to start with. And I think they were such wonderful human beings because of what they had learned at the design school. And so that was the bigger vision, that you design for humanity, and you design for creating that spirit of creative purpose and endeavor that never ever dies, and is not only something which is narrowly functional or utilitarian and can be put to use. They really could design anywhere and anything. And I think that that's really what I wanted to do. And I struggled to do it because I had no money to back me when I was starting Shrishti. It was really the battle to keep the creative ideas going without a financial backer. So it was that.
So I'm going to take a higher view and summarize what I take away from listening to you as your actual practice, not necessarily your intellectual understanding of design.
Yeah.
What you have done through your life of developing the pedagogy of design, pedagogy of just learning process, is, if to you, design is building conversations. And through conversations, opening people's minds to learn together and to let the future emerge on its own.
Perfect. Actually true also. Very true. Very insightful that were there. Thank you.
And I will ask you my last question now.
Ah.
My purpose in creating this dialogue about the legacy of India's imagination is to create an archive for the next 100 years that the next 3 generations can tap into. It's not neither a revivalist agenda of the past, nor a critic of the present, but more of a provocation for an evolving, emerging future, to feed into it through participation with our imagination. So what would be your provocation or your wisdom for those next 3 generations? I would like you to say it in a few sentences, share your wisdom for them.
I've thought about it a lot, not in quite the way that you're asking me this question, but you know, Uday, when you have grandchildren, suddenly that third generation is suddenly with you, right? Because I have a grandson who's going to be 11 and a granddaughter who's going to be 7. She's 6.5. And suddenly you realize that when they are as old as I am, what is their world going to look like? What would be what we have given them? And what would be the values or what would be the vista, if you like, of what they have in front of them. And I think that the world is narrowing down into making everything much, much more techno-deterministic than I think it needs to be. I think that there is this great feeling that we are at this brink, and people talk about the Anthropocene in one way, which is large numbers of humanity, and the others talk about technocentric universes in the other, and spaces, outer spaces, possibilities of a future. I think that the future, as I would like to see them, is to say that we as humanity can live in harmony with our environment, whatever it may be, because I do not know what the state of the environment would be by that time. And that, again, this whole notion of collective consciousness is something that I think about a lot. And I really think, therefore, what I feel my view of the future is peace with oneself, peace to work together for the community, and live in harmony with nature. And the nature need not necessarily only be nature as we knew it today. It probably would have expanded in our worldview, just like nature for me is very different from what nature or natural meant. We are exhausting some of these words now: nature, natural, environment. So I'm consciously not trying to use those words, but I'm saying that if you live, you have a context, you're in harmony with your context, you're at peace with yourself, and there is a lot of stillness that we can bring to the world. I think there's a lot of what shall I say, up here, what do you call that when things go up and down? There's a lot of frenetic energy in the system. And I would like to see that in three decades from now, or 3 generations from now, as we say, there is no need to be so restless and so frenetic and so impatient, that we can be calmer, we can be more silent, we can be more still, we can be more in harmony with each other, we can be in harmony with the environment or the context that we live in. And we don't aspire for more than what we have, because I think that is part of our generation's problem, is that our aspirations overcame actually the ability of even our planet to produce anything. And so we need to think of that. And I hope that that will be a more calm universe, three generations down, because I think it's going to take that long for that kind of change to evolve.
That's beautiful. Though I said this was last question, but now I have a last question. Do you have hope for that kind of future to emerge?
I think that it is inevitable that it will happen. I think that we are now more destructive than we've ever been, Uday. And I say that in real terms. I mean, I say that we destroy water supply sources, we destroy the commons, we destroy cultures, we destroy histories, we destroy heritage. And we don't really think of consequences that might come back and hit us. But I think that there is a time, and we've reached that time, when you reach the bottom of what you can do badly, and now then everything starts going up again. And I think we're close. I hope that we're close to the bottom, and that things will just turn around and we'll start climbing out of the hole we're making for ourselves, and begin to think more constructively about living. See, I don't use words like simpler, because I don't think anything's going to get simpler. Life is, the complexity levels are where they are. But if we could just generate that silence, that stillness, still that restless frenzy of always wanting to do something, about always aspiring to be more than what we can actually be ourselves, I think that we will possibly get there. And I think it will take time, but it will happen. And like I said, it's at every level, these fractals, right? The dimensions. It's at the level of self. It's at the level of the institutions of education, the institutions that you work in, the institutions we create, the nation state, and the economies that we all have to live by, whether they are global or local. It doesn't really matter today. It's all very confusing. So I think that we have to understand that.
Thank you so much, Geeta. You're borrowing your words. I will say today's conversation felt very calming.
Thank you.
Where have all the flowers gone? Long time passing. Where have all the flowers gone? Long time ago. Where have all the flowers gone? Young girls pick their very one. When will they ever learn? When will they ever learn? Where have all the young girls gone? Long time